Hi everyone, it's lovely to be here. Thank you all for coming along today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the art of everyday anarchism, or as I occasionally like to call it, boring anarchism, because it's not quite so flashy or sexy or radical, but it could potentially be something that we might genuinely and seriously want to consider in our current moment of political, well, I was going to say crisis, but I think complete collapse is probably getting a bit closer. Let's jump in, shall we? Okay, so I'm going to start off with basically, whenever I say that I work on anarchism or anarchist theory or anarchist history, invariably there's a series of questions I get asked, or there's a series of statements that I hear an awful lot. And so on the frequently asked questions, and generally speaking, there is some sort of cynical Christmas Day uncle involved in this. We've all had a few drinks, and he's all right, young lady. Well, not quite so young anymore, but answer me the following questions, sort of thing. So in an anarchist society, how exactly will you get people to work without the incentive of money? Bearing in mind, at no point have I said that money would necessarily be eliminated, but therein lies the assumption. How would I get people to work without forcing them, sort of thing? Or how would I prevent crime without the threat of jail, or without police to enforce it? He generally really likes the question, how would I ensure that people do not hoard goods? And then the other sorts of questions, how would I ensure everyone did their fair share of work, right? So I'm sure, these are probably things that may have flashed through your mind whenever you've heard anyone talk about an anarchist society or anarchism in general. Or either that, or, as the evening wears on a bit and a bit more sort of homemade punch flows, he stops asking questions, this cynical uncle of mine, and he just starts making statements such as, well, human nature is self-interested, so it couldn't work. Anarchism relies on people being all wonderfully good and noble and idealistic. Human beings are not equal. How are you going to account for that? Another favourite, nature is red in tooth and claw. Hierarchy is natural. And time again, I'm asked to account for some of these ideas. Now, I've got a few ways I can do this. I can counter, for example, well, all of these questions that you're asking about work, about crime, about the desire, the very desire to hoard goods, these are all questions that appear and come out of an existing hierarchical society, a capitalistic society. Would people necessarily, would you need to compel people to work if you weren't living in that, if you had more of an egalitarian order? So I could reply something like that. What I'm trying to do there is flag up the extent to which the social context or the social situation that we exist in actually generates some of the problems that they then want to say that they then want to attribute to human nature. Similarly, I can say back, these accounts we have of nature, again, are they neutral? Are they completely uninfluenced by the sorts of ways we live? Does our knowledge and the way we produce knowledge and the sort of assertions that we make about the world, does that have some sort of fairly major traction with the way we live? So I could do that. And I could say, potentially, in a more egalitarian society, you would not have these problems, and you would not necessarily need this kind of very rigid, very constrained, very combative, competitive account of human nature. But actually, if I was going to be both honest and sort of and keep faith with my concept of anarchism, what I've really got to say is I don't know. And I've actually got to say something more than that. I've got to say I also don't have the desire to know particularly. Okay, but what I can do is say, let's talk about it. Because the kind of anarchism I want to discuss today is less about me having a vision of how everything would work, having it all sussed theoretically out in my mind, how it could all be put together. And it's more about my openness to being able to discuss that and work out what that society, what that social pattern, what that social relationship would look like. My openness to being able to discuss that, and my capacity to see that conversation, to see that discussion as a source of social action in and of itself. So maybe I need to take a few steps back and just dig a bit more into the kind of philosophical basis of this. So this kind of anarchism, I argue, commits me to two main pillars, two main elements in my thinking about anarchism in this variety. And I would just say, just as a little disclaimer, there are many varieties of anarchism, all from very reputable sources. You are very welcome to survey the full spectrum. I'm just talking about the kind of anarchism, the everyday anarchism, the boring anarchism that I'm into. So it commits me to two things: the rejection of permanent authority and maximizing individual liberty in any given situation. Now, as you can see, I've had some fun with fonts here, and that's for a particular reason, because some of these terms I need to qualify a little bit. I need to pin them down just to make it clear what I'm talking about. So when I say rejection of permanent authority, what I'm trying to do there is indicate that a lot of the time, that's another one of the cliches. Anarchism is just chaotic. There's no leadership. There's no organization. That's not true. Anarchism, the absence of sort of archism, is the sort of central governance structure. It actually means an absence of that as a permanent authority. And it's the permanence where anarchists find the problem. It could well be that when you have a situation that needs a degree of someone who knows more about a situation, or a group of people who are more familiar with a problem, and they need to take a lead on something, that is not an un-anarchist position for me. What would become a problem was if that then became a permanent institution or structure. So that's the permanence explained. And then we've got the maximizing individual liberty in any given situation. And I want to do a bit more thinking around those two terms. Now, the eagle-eyed of you will notice something fairly quickly, and that's, especially if you're at all interested in political philosophy, that what I'm doing here is famously, there's the two accounts of freedom. There's the negative freedom, freedom from, and that's this, freedom from permanent forms of authority. And then there's the positive form of freedom, freedom to, and usually people attempt to try and draw a sort of stark dividing line. These are very, very different things. And what this kind of anarchism is going to try and do is have its cake and eat it too. So I feel that I need to bring these two forms, these two different accounts we've got of freedom, I need to bring them in conversation, that the one can't really exist without the other. And in doing so, a lot of that sort of depends on how I'm defining the individual and how I'm understanding liberty. So that's going to be my next stop for a few minutes. Following figures like Stephen Luke's, for example, I'm quite interested. Well, originally people like Kropotkin, Peter Kropotkin, although he didn't formulate that quite so explicitly. But I'm interested in this notion of the social individual. Now, in sort of standard or conventional accounts of classical liberalism, the individual is a very isolated figure. They are very self-contained. They have a sort of private inner life that's very discrete unto themselves. And this discrete unit goes out and it interacts with other people fairly begrudgingly because it has to survive. But ultimately, it's a discrete unit. Now, I'm not convinced particularly by this. I'm not convinced of this account of the individual as a being, as a form of consciousness, as a mind, if you will. I find it more persuasive, the idea, thinking of the individual rather than this unit that's tightly bound, more as a shifting constellation. Our individuality is made up of our relationships with people, our interactions with them, our transactions, and not just in a sort of fiscal or monetary sense, but our transactions with others and the wider environment. So we don't just have to concentrate when we talk about the social. It doesn't just have to mean other human beings. It can equally be the wider environment. And if you think about it, sort of the whole language is one of the sort of primary means by which we sort of describe or understand or kind of animate our consciousness of ourselves. And that language is in and of itself a tool for relating and connecting with others. So even our very, very, what feels our most intimate ways of understanding ourselves is always in negotiation with the wider world that we're in. So if you've got this sort of account of the social individual, when I then said previously, if I flick back, that I wanted to maximize individual liberty in any given situation, that then gives us a very different kind of option on this idea of individual liberty. Rather than being the traditional conventional account of individual liberty is doing whatever you want when you want it, individual liberty now becomes something more social. What does that look like? For me, this social account of liberty is freedom from ideological capture. What do I mean by that? I mean that I want people to feel free, liberated from having to be immersed in certain patterns of life that they've not necessarily been a part of generating or deciding for themselves. I want, especially when they are fully aware that there are other possibilities that they then have to deny, that are silenced, that are suppressed, or that are marginalized. So that's the kind of freedom from bit. Now the positive bit, freedom to, I believe that they should be part of decision making and taking. And what I mean by that is they should be actively negotiating and renegotiating the pattern of life as it affects you. So what I'm coming back to, what the sort of vision is of this everyday anarchism, is that freedom for me is a state of participatory potential. So it comes back to this idea of actively negotiating and renegotiating the pattern of life. So I believe that people should be a sort of active part of decision making. Quite often what we, and this is quite a different idea from those notions of being an active citizen. It's not enough for me that we just go out and take part in politics, in someone else's system, in someone else's form. It's that we've got to actually be part of deciding what the problems are that we want to deal with. So it's got to come back to a far more granular, far more molecular level. And when I say participatory potential, the other thing is I want to bring us away from this idea that we've all got to be dashing about and being noble and being active citizens sort of thing. Because actually participatory potential has also got to include the right to choose not to participate if we don't want to. As such, for me, anarchism then is not a perfect society. It's not an optimum social order. It's not a predetermined economic system, and it's not a single culture. Now, there are really good anarchist accounts for all of these sorts of ideas, but they're ideas. It wouldn't actually be anarchism if I insisted upon them, even if they made perfect logical sense. For me, one person's utopia is always going to be somebody else's prison. So, as such, I'm more interested in this idea that anarchism is an outlook on the world. It's a way of thinking, it's an ethics of practice, but above all, I keep coming back to this notion that it's active participation in decision framing, making, and taking. And the underline on the active is, again, this idea that at the moment, if you want to be active in politics, for example, if someone encourages you to go and be active in politics, they might tell you you should go out and campaign for a party, or you might get together with a local group and agitate for something. Yeah, that's all great, but I also think people should be involved in the step before that, and that is deciding on the sorts of problems that we ought to be caring about.